Life's too short. It's too short for that. It's about relationships and feeling fulfilled, not only financially and career-wise, but with the people that you love.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. My guest today is Jane Davis, single mom, widow, suicide survivor, health educator, and ultrarunner. Jane happens to be my neighbor, and over the past year and a half, my wife and I have gotten to know her and her story. So she came to mind immediately as a perfect guest to have on Andrew Petty is Dying. Hers is a remarkable story of hope, tragedy, grief, and triumph, and is chock full of powerful lessons for tapping into the power of our mortality to live fully and joyfully now. Her experiences have taught her just how precious today is, and she models that in her everyday life. This conversation will move you, inspire you, and equip you with insight and strategies for making the most of every moment. You've had two really heartbreaking encounters with mortality over the past decade. Would you tell us about what happened with Quincy?
Of course. In 2008, my husband, Quincy, was diagnosed with prostate cancer at the age of 41. We found out he had prostate cancer because he went into kidney failure. And he went into kidney failure on an airplane on the way back from Florida. Jana at the time was a year. And after being in the hospital for a while and the doctors unsure of what was going on, it took almost 2 months for them to diagnose it as prostate cancer because he was so young and active and fit. And
how long had you and Quincy been together at this point?
So we met in 2005. So only 3 years had we been together. Jana was born in 2007 and he was diagnosed in 2008. Because the cancer was so aggressive, it had already spread outside of his prostate and had gone into his lymphatic system. And that's where the kidney failure came from, is the pressure put on his ureters. So he was given 2 weeks to live.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
After an agonizing 2 months of not knowing what the heck's going on.
Right.
You get the news that it's this in 2 weeks or 2 months?
2 weeks.
Holy smoke.
And at the time, we weren't married, but the day before chemo, he decided we should get married. And so we were married at the hitching post and had Taco Del Mar cater.
Perfect.
With our friends and family. And then he went into treatment. And his positive attitude, I believe, is what helped get him through not 2 weeks, but 16 months before he passed away in February of 2010. And so he, even the day he was put on hospice, continued to maintain a positive attitude despite what was happening.
Wow, that is a tremendous story in so many respects, unbelievably sad. And I can't imagine what that felt like. Here you are creating a new life with Quincy, your daughter, and then in an airplane, 35,000 feet, you run into this brick wall that you didn't know was coming and you didn't know what it was, and boom. What was that like when you realized this is happening?
Well, when you have a toddler, you have to maintain a optimistic viewpoint. And instead of saying 2 weeks and falling apart, I ensured we had every available resource available, and we fought hard. We were traveling to Seattle for clinical trials. The poor man was drinking lots of pomegranate juice and acupuncture and everything I could think of, both Western and Eastern medicine. And in fact, it did work for a period of time. The cancer seemed to subside, and he went out and bought a new mountain bike and new skis, and he was ready to have a new release on life. Sadly, it did return in November of 2009, And 2 months later, he would pass away. And I think I was 36 at the time. I had just met someone I expected to spend the rest of my life with, as well as having a young child. Jana was 2 when her dad died. So her memory is very, very vague of that moment and those time. But it was just surviving every day was really how we made it through.
How did it impact the relationship that the two of you had? What was the experience of your relationship with this inevitability hanging over your heads? I mean, we're all going to die. It's just a matter of when and how. In this case, you and Quincy knew what was probably going to happen and what was causing it. So I'm just curious, what was your relationship like during that time?
I think that, and I have had that asked to me before, as far as, would you have rather it been an accident where you didn't know it was happening? Or was the prognosis and understanding it was terminal, was that more beneficial for your own sanity? And our conversations were deep and extensive, and we were able to prepare ourselves for his passing, where his last comment to me when he was put on hospice was, "But I'm not done loving you yet." And I think that was the most difficult part of it, because we knew the days were limited. So we watched a lot of Weeds and Grey's Anatomy. Like, we just watched movies and ate ice cream together as long as he could until he became too sick. But we just spent quality time together. I put off things that were no longer important to spend those last moments with him.
My goodness.
Yeah.
I'm going to fast forward now. As much as I hate to leave that part of the story for the moment, I want to fast forward and add on this other piece to your story that's happened more recently, when you had another tragic encounter with mortality. What happened?
Yes. So in 2018, in January, I received a call no one ever expects or ever wants, that my father had died from suicide. He was 89. He had been a forester his whole life. He had taught me to love the mountains, to love to be outside and to be active, skiing and cross-country skiing, and about the trees and the plants and surviving in the wilderness. And his body had broken down. At 89, he no longer could enjoy the things that he loved so much. His wife also was diagnosed with dementia, and his ability to cope with my mother's failing health resulted in him deciding he was better off no longer with us. And I believe he felt he was a burden, and he chose to jump 4 stories out of his assisted living. And that was in January of 2018. So it has just been 2 years.
I'm so sorry. So sorry.
Thank you.
And I want to pause because there's so much grief there and there's so much tragedy there. There are going to be some people listening who can relate a lot, not because the circumstances are the same, but because their depth of grief is the same, and some of it may be very fresh. What would you say to any of the listeners who are in the midst of the kind of grief that you know really well? What would you say to them for someone who's not traveled as much of this grief journey as you have yet?
I would say sit in the grief. It's okay to sit in it. It's okay to acknowledge it. It's okay to talk about it. You're not alone. That it feels like your chest is crushing, that the walls are coming in on you, and that this is how it will always be. But that's not the case. Tomorrow's better. The next day's even better. And there will be ebbs and flows. This feeling will come back. It isn't a process that goes away, but it becomes easier. And talk about it. Talk about your feelings, your sadness, your anger, your grief. Talk about it.
And for those of you listening, you can't see Jane's face, but I can, of course. And she's smiling and in pain at the same time. I can tell, and everything that she's saying, I can tell she really means. And of course, you come from a place of having experienced it. So it's totally authentic. And I wish that all of you could see Jane's face, because she is smiling and crying at the same time, which I think, my sister, when she lost her husband, that was her word to me when I naively asked, "What have you learned from this loss?" And she said, "I don't like that question, because it isn't really that way. It happened, and I wish it hadn't happened. And I loved him, and he's gone. And I'm extremely sad about that all the time. And I'm also happy sometimes. And both of those things coexist." And your face is an exact representation of what I learned from my sister in that moment, when sometimes it's not about deep philosophical questions. It's just about confronting, this is life. Well, thanks for that word to folks who are in the midst of grief. What specific resources would you recommend for people who are like, okay, I got it, I'm going to sit in the grief and all that kind of stuff, but like, what else can I do specifically, practically, in a concrete way to deal with what they're experiencing?
Boy, everyone copes so very differently. I don't think there's one Band-Aid that fits all hurt and wounds. For me, it was running. After Q died, all I wanted to do was lay in bed and self-pity. But then this little person came peeking up over the bed and said, "Mommy," and I recognized I couldn't do that. There were people relying on me, specifically a little 2-year-old. So at that moment, I knew there had to be something. I needed to find passion inside of me. And for me, that was running.
Was that already a passion at that time in your life? Something you'd already discovered?
For sure.
Okay.
For sure. I hadn't started ultra running yet. The Costa Rica came after that in October of 2010. I had been training for a run. Quincy had been training me. Quincy doesn't run, but he loved to drive the car and with the baby in the back and meet me along my route, bringing me whatever I needed. And I'd been training for a run in San Francisco that was for prostate cancer. I'd been raising money, and it was in April of 2010. And my thought was he would be there. And after he passed away, I just thought, no, there's no way I'm doing this. I'm done. I have no desire to do anything more other than sleep and drink vodka. So super
good plan,
productive. And my girlfriend from kindergarten on called me and said, "I'm running this with you." She's not a runner. We're going to California. The baby's coming and we're running. And she went with me. And it was awful. I was in a terrible state, and just every mile
You were
was
in a terrible
excruciating.
state?
I was just in a terrible state because
Yeah.
Quincy was supposed to be there. He
Yeah.
wasn't there.
Yeah.
Every mile was excruciatingly, emotionally challenging and difficult. I hadn't eaten in months, so I was just in terrible physical and emotional, but I finished. And she finished, and Jana was there, and I woke up and recognized that this life goes on. This life goes on, and Jana needs me, and I have a purpose. I'm not sure what it is at this stage, but I have a purpose. And so for me, running began that connection, and then came the Costa Rica. And
real quickly, let me tell listeners what Costa Rica is. So Jane told me this before we started recording, that she signed up for a race that had a short paragraph description in something online or a brochure or something, and you went, and turned out it wasn't a one-day thing. It was 5 marathons, 1 marathon a day for 5 days, right?
yes.
Back and forth across the country of Costa Rica. So that's the Costa Rica thing. Go ahead.
Yes. So at that moment, I recognized running far was part of who I was and where my passion and where I found healing. And since then, I've run many ultras. I often add travel because Quincy wanted me to show Jana the world, and she often goes with me, and I bring them as well. I brought Quincy from 2010 to 2018 and scattered his ashes at the highest point of every run. And after 2018, I brought my dad as well.
Wow.
So now when I run an ultra, I bring their ashes and they're part of the process, and the physical pain and the emotional pain, they're with me every step of the way.
You mentioned that Quincy wanted you to show Jane to the world, which helps me understand how every time I look on Facebook and see a post from you, you're in some new exotic location. I'm like, Jane, how do you do this? It's unbelievable, because Quincy asked you to do it. That's
Quincy
awesome.
asked me to do that.
I love it. Well,
Sure.
It appears that you're fulfilling his wish.
Thank you.
How have these losses changed you?
I believe I am slower to react. I'm intentional in what I do, who I spend time with, my thoughts, and how I express myself to the people who I love. Time is short and moments are brief. And if we're not in those moments fully present, it's a life that's not lived to the best of your ability.
There's a lot of talk these days about being mindful and being present, and maybe it's just me because I'm a little neurotic, but I'm always like, well, how do you be perfectly present all the time? It sounds stressful to try and be perfectly present, but you've had these experiences that have sharpened your focus on the moment and the value of the moment and the person that you're with in the moment and the way you're choosing who you're with in the moment. What is the takeaway for us who haven't experienced what you've experienced in terms of being present in the moment with people, and how do we actually do that?
Right. It's hard. It's hard.
Even for you who've had these experiences.
For sure. I often have to remind myself to listen, not talk so much, but just listen. Stories are important, and everyone has a story, and it may be very different from mine, and I may not understand it, but that person should have a voice. And I believe that was what happened with my father. His voice didn't matter anymore. His story wasn't being heard. And as we know, as mature adults, when they live in an assisted living or somewhere where they're just not as socialized, it becomes a problem. And I think we all need to pause and think about who is in our presence and listen and just ask and not be afraid of what you're going to hear. It may be uncomfortable, especially if it has to do with death and dying, but it's a story someone is eager to tell.
So that's really interesting. You have a greater tolerance for the uncomfortable moments with people. What's the value of the uncomfortable moments that you've discovered? Why do you go there sometimes when other people might back off and go, okay, all right, it's getting weird?
It's getting weird, yeah. For me, it is a deeper connection with another human being. We all suffer from the human condition, and that's fear and hesitation and being afraid of being judged and understanding that we're all feeling that allows those moments to happen and to embrace them.
I first met you at my brother-in-law's Christmas party, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I think you were fairly new to town, and
A couple weeks.
we didn't even have much conversation at that gathering. But I remember thinking there was something that was a little bit different about you. You had a way of initiating a gaze and keeping a gaze, not just with me, but with everyone there, and giving them your attention that was different. And I didn't know your story at that time. I didn't know about Quincy. I didn't know about your dad, and all of the roads you've traveled since then. That really helps me understand a little bit more about how you've become the person you are in social settings and in more intimate one-on-one kinds of settings. It's helped you get dialed in on the importance of that person in that moment. And you said, even having gone through what you've gone through, it's easy to forget. How do you remind yourself in those moments when you find yourself losing track of the fact that time is fleeting and life is precious?
I go for a run.
Yeah?
Yep. Because it stops everything. It really does.
So for some people, a run is an option. For other people listening, a run won't be an option, or
Yes.
even if it was an option, it would not be their preferred option. How would people go about finding an activity that would serve a similar purpose as running does for you?
Sure.
What are the ingredients that make it what it is for you?
First of all, be okay with getting uncomfortable.
There's that theme again. You keep bringing it up. I wish we could avoid the discomfort piece, but we can't.
You
can we?
can't. Even if it's finding something that, who knows, maybe it will bring you something that you didn't even know, but you have to step out there and take that leap first. Maybe it's pottery class. Maybe it's joining a book club. Maybe it's learning how to crochet and not being good at it. It's okay not to be good at something. I'm not an amazing runner. I'm very slow, but I'm also determined. And I think if you have the ability to be uncomfortable, have some determination to want to move the needle forward, stating, I don't want to stay in this feeling of grief and sadness forever, but I also know I have these passions. What are they? And it may take a few things, and it may take failing. And I say failing is your first attempt in learning, right? A toddler learns how to walk by failing a lot. And we as adults need to learn that failing's part of learning and part of healing, that we may not get it right the first time, and that's okay. It's your first attempt in learning.
It seems like you've really come to enjoy and appreciate discomfort, because you know that it, and you experience that a lot through running, but you know that that discomfort produces something even more valuable to you.
For sure.
Which is what? What do you get on the other side of the discomfort when you push yourself in a new way or a little bit further than you have? Or
I get to know myself better. I recognize my strengths. And those strengths aren't just the ability to run a long distance. It's the ability to fight through the hurt and the sadness and those tough moments where I just want to give up. It's the ability to continue putting one foot in front of the other. And if I step back a little bit, I know that I can still proceed to go forward, that this isn't going to define me.
how have your experiences with loss changed you as a parent to your beautiful daughter, Jana, with the amazing hair?
She does have amazing
Who can
hair.
carve on skis better than I'll ever be able to. I'm super jealous. How has it changed your perspective as a mom?
I believe that I'm very open with her about grief. I'm very open with her about death and dying. She was a part of all of these losses. So she too is dealing and coping and finding her way as well. But as a young person, she's 12. So her brain development isn't at the same place mine is. Sometimes I think it's has developed more than mine.
Totally get
I wonder
that.
who's parenting who. But I think our conversations about death and dying have made her as a human more well-rounded because she understands that that is just part of living.
She has a poise that not many 12-year-olds have. And again, I haven't spent much time with Janie, but you can just tell that there's something different about the way she carries herself. What are we missing as parents today? What are we failing to provide our kids or to teach our kids that we really need to make sure they're learning?
Personally, I believe we need to talk about death and dying more.
How do you do that with, my boys are 10 and 8. How do you sit down and have a conversation about death with kids who are in the prime of life?
It's challenging. It really is challenging. I believe a great way to do it, and we lived in Kenya, so culturally, death and dying are treated very, very differently. And bringing different cultures and how they cope and deal with death and dying is a great way to introduce the topic in a way that's not specifically talking about one person who may be sick with cancer or just died in a car accident. It's much more global. And how do we as parents ensure that it's just a natural process in life, that death is just as important to talk about as living, and it's okay to grieve, and how do we grieve, and how do we grieve in a healthy way, And also checking ourselves. How do we talk about it? Do we avoid talking about it for fear of hurting them or traumatizing them when in fact it could be beneficial? So it's really conversations. And I think every family is going to have their own way of doing so. For us, living in Kenya was very beneficial because funerals are a celebration. And so how Kenyans process death is very different than how we process death. Often we avoid taking our children to a funeral where, in fact, they should be present. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just conversation.
Helping them to appreciate the circle of life, to quote
Exactly.
The Lion King.
Yeah, exactly.
How would you describe your philosophy of life now compared to what it was before Quincy and your dad died?
Before I had the experience of such close death, I'd experienced death. I'd lived in Malawi as a Peace Corps volunteer. I'd spent a lot of time at funerals. But prior to that, I was kind of immune to it, I guess you could say.
Like many of us are.
Like many of us are. Like it didn't affect me. I'm just keep going. I was always fast paced, always eager for the next day, always eager for the next week, the next vacation, always looking forward to something versus being here and enjoying what I have right here. So I reach out to my friends, I reach out to family, I ensure I am making time for people that are important in my life and letting them know how I feel about them versus prior, it was like, well, I don't have time this week. And it may just be a text now. Of course, texts back then weren't as popular, but now it can just be thinking of you. And it doesn't have to be a lot. And it's learning to forgive and learning to embrace what's happening right now, even if it is painful, versus trying to figure out a way to get rid of it.
What benefits have you experienced from that new philosophy of life that was forced upon you, but now you've been living that philosophy for some time? And how has your quality of life changed in terms of relationships and things?
Relationships are still hard. That's changed that much. I think being vulnerable. I was not willing to be vulnerable back in 2005 or 2000, any time prior to 2010. I wasn't willing to be vulnerable. I wasn't willing to put myself in a position where I hurt. And now I'm okay feeling hurt. I'm okay processing that. And I'm not willing to settle for something that is constantly making me feel unauthentic. I believe I try to be as authentic as possible in living my best life. And do I make mistakes? Plenty of them. But I'm also willing to sit with those rather than try to push them away or deny them. It's being honest and being authentic and being vulnerable.
That's counterintuitive because you might expect that having experienced that much tragedy and loss, that the opposite would happen. You'd be hardened now to ever experiencing something like that again or welcoming vulnerability or hurt. But it's done the opposite.
It's done the opposite because, like I've said previously, our stories are important. And if we don't tell our stories, we're riddled with depression and all these manifestations, physical illness, mental illness, where we're just bottling everything up to such an extreme that it doesn't serve us or anyone around us because we lash out versus saying, I'm hurt. We just get angry. So
I'm already going to go ahead and extend an invitation for you to come back another time. Will you do that? Because I want to dig into that story piece more with you at some point because I can tell there's a lot there for you around the richness and value of our stories.
Yes.
So will you come back and we can talk about that again sometime?
Of course.
Cool. What would you tell your pre-Quincy self if you could visit with her for an afternoon?
Oh, I'd tell her so many things. But I think the biggest thing is to slow down, to appreciate this moment right now.
How do we do that? How would your pre-Quincy self have done that? What changes could you have made back then that would have helped you do that?
I think the biggest thing is stopping. I think we need to pause every once in a while and think about where we're at and what we're doing, and is it serving us at this moment?
And what's the cost of not doing that? What price do we pay?
There's a lot of cost. In my opinion, I think that the biggest one is lack of self-identity. We don't know who we are. We're living this expectation of what we're supposed to do. At 35, I was a career woman. My daughter went to daycare. I did the rush, meetings in the evenings, maybe a dinner here that we sat down together, but life was very rushed. And I didn't know what my identity was. I didn't know who I was. I was just living this expectation of what was expected of me at that time. And 2 months after Quincy died, I quit my job and I reevaluated where I was, because that was a huge loss. And I now had this little child that I needed to raise on my own and trying to figure that out. And I think there are a lot of things that we look back and say, if I'd only done it this way, or if only did it a little bit different. And now's the time to think about that.
And since we're neighbors, you live just up the street, and I get to see that you're truly living that out. You moved to Steamboat to follow Jana's ski coach, who you developed a real partnership with, and helping Jana become not just a better skier, but, developing a little human. And you moved here for that. And that probably would not have been in the cards, I'm guessing, when you were a career woman and Jana was going to daycare. But that really represents, from the outside looking anyway, correct me if I'm wrong, but a real total revamping of your priorities. We're going to move to Steamboat for Jana to continue her ski career, and that's a major deal. So you're putting your money where your mouth is.
Right. It's a leap. And I didn't know if I'd fail or succeed, and I still don't. It's a daily. I don't look too far down the road. I try to think of just today, how do I make this little world of ours a little bit better?
But that flies in the face of all of the conventional wisdom, all of the people out there on other podcasts and things saying, how can you 10x your productivity today? How can you, by 45 retire with 10 million in the bank? That turns the conventional wisdom on its head. So what do you say to the conventional wisdom?
Life's too short. It's too short for that. It's about relationships and feeling fulfilled, not only financially and career-wise, but with the people that you love, and then with the person that you are, because you need that self-love. If there's no self-love, you can't provide that for anyone else.
And you said something that I think is huge a few minutes ago. You said pre-Quincy, you were living an expectation, not living your authentic self. There's a lot said today about the authentic self and all that. It means something different to everybody, but I want to double down on that, because I think that's a really important thing for all of us to hear. The way that I come at that concept is to say that before we can become who we can be, we first have to become who we are. And I think what you're saying when you say we're living an expectation is to say we're trying to become some version of ourselves that we think we ought to be for whatever reason, and fail along the way to actually appreciate who we are. And when we don't appreciate and know who we are, then we don't have a starting point, a valid starting point to become who we can be. Is that making sense?
Yeah, totally.
Because that's a theme that I've been chewing on a lot lately. And to hear you say it with the credibility that you bring to it because of your life experience, I go, there's something here.
Most definitely.
So it's not navel gazing. It's not like some sort of attempt to achieve enlightenment. You're saying there's real world bottom line value in getting to know yourself.
Exactly.
So I could keep going, but it would just be scratching my own itch and my own curiosities. We've got to just keep moving to a conclusion here for the sake of the listeners, and we are going to have you back. What else, as we close, do you hope that listeners to your story will take away from it?
I guess I hope that listeners feel that they're not alone, that grief and sadness and all those emotions that go with the loss of a loved one is part of this living thing that we go through, this human condition, that you should feel that and talk about it. Share your stories with the people that love you because they want to hear it. They may just be afraid to ask. And simultaneously ask to hear someone's story so that they know that you are there for them instead of ignoring it. Most of the people that are still in my life from the time when Quincy died are the ones that asked the hard questions. Those that were fearful of my reaction or of hurting me more, which was impossible, are no longer in my life.
So people that stayed on the surface kind of floated out of orbit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So ask, share and ask.
And people listening to this, for one reason or another, are interested in becoming the person they were made to be and living the life they were made to be. And they're interested in some way in this mortality piece that we talk about on this podcast. How can we embrace our mortality to encourage us to live more fully now? For listeners who haven't had these grief experiences but still want to capture the benefit of your story in their own life, how do we do that? What are practices? How can we, because we don't have the grief, we don't have the actual pain motivating us moment by moment to remember that life is fleeting, but it is still fleeting. So how do we activate this? How do we integrate this into our life?
When Quincy first passed away, and then when my father did as well, I just every day just wrote 3 things I was grateful for that had happened that day. And it was hard because at the time I wasn't grateful. Mm-hmm. I was angry and sad. But there are still some beautiful things that are happening around you, whether that was Jana's first words or my mom's comment when with dementia, I told her my dad was hiking because telling her he was gone was just too much anymore. And she said, "Oh, that man's always hiking." And so humor became something that I was able to grab onto a little bit. But just instead of feeling the overwhelming sadness and grief, trying to find a couple things that you can pull that are just something beautiful that happened that day.
The power of human connection, the importance of slowing down, the value of being present in the moment, embracing and using discomfort. All of these things stuck out to me from this conversation with Jane. One of the things that stuck out to me most, though, was that even Jane, with as much tragedy and death as she's experienced, and as much resolve as it's given her to live differently as a result, even Jane has to work hard at keeping the main thing, which makes it even more of a challenge for those of us who haven't encountered death like Jane has, which drives home the point that tapping into the power of our mortality is a mindset, a discipline, and a practice, not a one-and-done kind of thing. If it was easy and came naturally, more of us would be doing it. I, for one, don't want my life to slip by unlived, and I'm betting you don't either. What helps you keep the main thing? Share your thoughts, tips, and habits on my Facebook page @AndrewPettyCoach to keep the conversation going. Listening to this podcast is a great way to cultivate the mindset, discipline, and practice of tapping into the power of your mortality. So subscribe today if you haven't already and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening today, and see you next time.